We begin tonight with breaking news. This evening, President Trump fired the director of the FBI. James Comey was leading the investigation into whether associates of Mr. Trump colluded with the Russian government to influence the U.S. presidential election.
That was the CBS Evening News on May 9th, 2017, the day that President Trump fired James Comey. In a letter informing the FBI director of his firing, the president said that he felt Comey was not able to effectively lead the bureau. Here's how our own Major Garrett reported the news that night.
The letter from President Trump to Comey is blunt. You are hereby terminated and removed from office, effective immediately. In an accompanying letter, newly confirmed Deputy Attorney General Ron Rosenstein writes he recommended Comey be fired over his decision last summer to publicly announce he would not recommend charges in the Hillary Clinton email server investigation. Rosenstein wrote, "The director announced his own conclusions about the nation's most sensitive criminal investigation without the authorization of duly appointed Justice Department leaders." Comey made the decision after Attorney General Loretta Lynch removed herself from the investigation. A meeting between Lynch and former President Bill Clinton had called her impartiality into question. A letter from Attorney General Jeff Sessions to the president, also dated today, says the director must be someone who follows faithfully the rules and principles of the Department of Justice. President Trump had given Comey a public show of support after his inauguration and as recently as April 11th.
I have confidence in him. We'll see what happens. It's going to be interesting.
Having repeatedly told this Congress we are
testifying before Congress last week, Comey defended his decisions to go public in July and sent a new letter to Congress in October reopening the Clinton investigation just days before the election.
And so I stared at Speak and Conceal. Speak would be really bad. There's an election in 11 days. Lordy, that would be really bad. Concealing, in my view, would be catastrophic.
In his letter firing Comey, Mr. Trump referenced the FBI's current investigation into whether Trump campaign officials coordinated with Russian operatives during the election. I greatly appreciate your informing me on 3 separate occasions, Mr. Trump wrote, that I am not under investigation. Comey was in the Los Angeles FBI field office when he heard of his dismissal. Scott Comey's firing has stunned FBI agents across the country. Some worry the Russian investigation may now be compromised and wonder if it will proceed aggressively or at all.
That was 3 years ago, and now we are joined with Major Garrett and Catherine Herridge. Major is the CBS News chief Washington correspondent, and Catherine is CBS News senior investigative correspondent. Thank you both for being with me. Major, let's go ahead and start with you. You were at the White House, actually, that night. What went through your mind when you learned that the president had removed Comey? I remember a collective gasp in the newsroom, but you were actually right there at the White House. Recount it for us.
So it felt like an earthquake. All of us in the White House press area, in our small cubicles or in the general collecting area where White House reporters who don't have a cubicle or an assigned workspace gather, got this release and this letter, and it felt as if the earth moved beneath our feet. This was a massive, massive confrontation between a newly elected president who swore to the country that if he was elected president, he would be a disruptive force. And this was by far the most disruptive action President Trump had taken to date. And it set up a clash between the FBI and this president that would run through a yet to be announced Mueller investigation that would come several days later, and everything related to this question of what did the Trump campaign do or not do in terms of colluding with, talking to, communicating with, in any way touching Russian operatives seeking to interfere and meddle in the 2016 election. And I, from the moment we got this news, raced out to the live shot position on the north lawn of the White House and stood there for the next 45 minutes. And we did a series of special reports live where I read the various letters on air as I got them handed to me. It was the beginning of an incredibly intense days, or a series of days at the White House, set in motion by the Comey firing. I've often said that there is a cliche about life that you feel when things are stressful that you are drinking from a fire hose. I often said in those days, I wish you were only one. It feels like about 12.
I remember the question about whether or not Comey would even be allowed at to take the department plane back home to Washington. It was so surprising in that moment. And Catherine, I want to turn to you. If Comey hadn't been fired, would there have been no special counsel investigation by Robert Mueller? Was this actually a strategic misstep in the way that it was handled by a new Trump administration?
Well, I think most journalists, and I'm sure Major would agree with me, that the firing of then FBI Director James Comey was really the final catalyst that set into motion the wheels for the appointment of the special counsel, Robert Mueller. And I like to look at May 2017 as this sort of pivotal period, and I lay it out as 8 days in May. So May 9th is when FBI Director James Comey is fired, and then by the 17th, the special counsel Robert Mueller is appointed. And what's also important about May 2017 is that we are 9 months into the surveillance of a Trump campaign aide. So we're on our third FISA warrant. And at that point, then FBI lawyer Lisa Page testified to Congress that they still had no evidence of Russian collusion. Her words were that it was still unproven or still unknown. So think about it. They were 9 months into the most aggressive way of gathering information about a Trump campaign advisor. They still had no evidence of collusion. And then the special counsel would be appointed, and then for 2 more years would investigate and would still not find evidence that rose to a criminal level for any kind of prosecution, Lana.
And Major, in your book, Mr. Trump's Wild Ride, you dedicate an entire chapter to Comey's firing and the events that followed it. It's titled 10 Days in May. It seems like you and Catherine are both into the number of days in May.
Right.
But in it, you
8
wrote...
days, 10 days, take your pick, take your pick. It was a hell of a month. Trust me, it was one hell of a month, okay?
So funny.
It was. And now May it continues to be crazy for us. But I want to quote from your book. You wrote, "So began 10 days that convulsed the nation and the world as no other 10 had in the tumultuous first year of the Trump presidency. The firing of Comey was just the beginning of the mind-bending bizarreness of it all." So looking back at that time, what stands out to you most about the events that immediately followed Mr. Comey's dismissal?
Well, the White House had a very hard time explaining why Comey was fired, and that letter didn't really add up, and Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the press secretary at the time, had a hard time explaining what all the various reasons were. I asked her, and other reporters asked her about this assertion from the White House that there had been this lack of confidence expressed at the field level among FBI agents in Comey's leadership. We learned later from the Mueller report that she made that up out of whole cloth. So the White House was struggling in the early hours and a day or two after the Comey firing to explain what the actual reason and justification was. And then the president gives an interview to NBC and says, it's the Russia deal. And everyone's like, what? You're just essentially admitting it, that you're frustrated about this Russia investigation? So you're going to fire the head of the FBI? Then the president invites in the Russian ambassador and the Russian foreign minister into the White House. Russian paid media is in there snapping photographs of it. We don't know anything about it in the White House press corps. So state-owned media in Russia is in there snapping pictures of the president, yucking it up with these 2 top Russian officials. In the midst of all that, that strikes us as mind-bending. Then there's reporting that the White House can't deny and has a hard time wrapping its arms around that in those conversations with the Russians, the president might have accidentally divulged some sensitive information about another U.S. ally. That all happened in like the 3 or 4 days right after the Comey firing. Oh, by the way, North Korea tested a ballistic missile. There was a massive hack in the United States that might have been perpetrated by North Koreans. I mean, those 10 days felt as if everything was turning over and over and over, not just once or twice, but at warp speed. And I have had reporters who I worked alongside at the White House in 2017 read my book sometime later, it came out in 2018, and come up to me and say, I forgot half of that. And I'm like, wait a minute, how can you forget it? You wrote the stories. They're like, I still forgot it. Because that's what happened in that period of time. Things moved so rapidly, you couldn't even keep track of the things you were doing as your daily journalistic work, because 2 days later felt like 6 months ago.
Well, Catherine, you know the FBI so well. There has been a lot of questions, especially with Comey recently tweeting and becoming a publicly quoted figure again, at least a little bit. What type of legacy did James Comey leave behind at the FBI?
I think one of the big things I've seen, and I've been working in this national security space for 2 decades, is that I can't remember a time, and maybe Major will agree with me as well, when you've seen former national security officials, whether it's law enforcement or intelligence, after they leave office become so public and vocal in their political opinions about very sensitive issues. Director Comey would state publicly that his goal was always to rise above the politics with the Bureau. And that is obviously what most Americans expect of the premier law enforcement agency. But when you look at his tenure at the Bureau, what you see, especially in 2016, is that the Bureau was really thrust into some of the most political discussions at the time. Remember, in 2016, the FBI had an open criminal investigation into the mishandling of classified information by then candidate Hillary Clinton and her personal email server that she used for government business. He made a very public statement, which is never done, laying out why they would not prosecute her in this case, saying that they lacked evidence of intent. And he went around his boss, then Attorney General Loretta Lynch, and then just days before the election, he reopened the Clinton email investigation, and critics have said they felt he really tapped the brakes on Hillary Clinton's momentum in the final days of the presidential election. And then on the other hand, it was under Director Comey that they opened a counterintelligence investigations. That's designed to gather intelligence, not so much to launch a criminal case, that focused on alleged collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. So just stop for a minute and think about the fact that in 2016, here in the United States, both presidential campaigns were under FBI investigation. And this was under Director Comey's tenure. I mean, to me, this is still kind of a mind-blowing data point when you look at that period.
Absolutely, and you make it such a succinct point, Catherine, with that. One thing that has united diehard Democrats and diehard Republicans in many cases is their dislike of James Comey. Meanwhile, Major, the Justice Department now is moving to drop its criminal case against former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. What more did we learn about the FBI's case against Flynn from this decision? And does this give the president a sense of justification in firing Comey?
It does, but the president, as he often does, conflates and exaggerates and says one thing equals 10 other things. And in this case, that's not true. The Flynn case has always had problems, and revelations that the Justice Department prosecutors did not, under federal precedential requirements, give to Mike Flynn's attorney showed that they did not have a material basis for the line of inquiry they had when they questioned the then National Security Advisor Mike Flynn at the White House, meaning it was not material to the underlying investigation. That the FBI agents who conducted the interviews reported back that they did not detect deception. Now, look, there are plenty of people who are writing columns today saying, look, if you lie to the FBI, end of story. That's it. You're prosecuted. Because there's an old phrase in Washington that Catherine, by the way, everything that Catherine said in her last answer, perfectly spot on. I agree with all of it. But Catherine knows this phrase. You can lie to your spouse, you can lie to the media, you can lie to your friends, but you can't lie to the FBI.
Don't lie to the feds.
And there are plenty of people who believe, right. And people believe, look, Michael Flynn, of his own volition, lied to the FBI. End of story. That's a prosecutable case, and he should have been prosecuted, and the Justice Department should never abandon that. Okay, but there's a whole other body of thought, and the Justice Department has now filed a writ before the court saying, no, it wasn't material, he didn't attempt to deceive, and it wasn't a legitimate form to conduct that interview, and that there was some element or motive to entrap him, to catch him in a perjury trap. So that's what the Justice Department is now asserting, and everyone is sort of gnawing over the bones of this one case. There are plenty of things wrong with this case, and you don't need to read this filing from the Justice Department to deduce that. You read the Justice Department Inspector General Michael Horowitz's report earlier identifies problems with the Flynn case. They've been in full public view for a while. But the problems with the Flynn case do not, as the president loves to suggest and again suggested today, dismantle any justification for the Mueller investigation itself or the counterintelligence investigation. There were still things the FBI then and now still believes were worth looking into. As Catherine noted a while ago, there were problems also noted in the Horowitz report about the continuation of the Federal Intelligence Surveillance Act court wiretaps of Carter Page. That's another part of this story. But the problems with the Flynn case have been viewed for a while. It is unusual for the Justice Department to pull back as it has. But it was a problematic case, for sure. But that doesn't allow the president, or should not allow the president, to say all of it is a hoax and all of it is unjustified. That's a bridge way, way too far.
And Major, as you say, that's very unusual. And Catherine had that exclusive interview with the person at the very top, Attorney General William Barr, on Thursday. You asked him, Catherine, about the role that James Comey and other former FBI officials had in Michael Flynn's case. I want to play part of that for our viewers.
Who at the FBI was driving this?
Well, this particular episode, it looks like the impetus came from the 7th floor.
The 7th floor is Director Comey.
I believe it's Director Comey and the deputy's office.
Mm-hmm. Based on the evidence that you have seen, did senior FBI officials conspire to throw out the National Security Advisor?
Well, as I said, this is a particular episode, and it has some troubling features to it, as we've discussed. But I think, that's a question that really has to await an analysis of all the different episodes that occurred through the summer of 2016 and the first several months of the President Trump's administration.
What are the consequences for these individuals?
Well, I don't want to, we're in the middle of looking at all of this, John Durham's investigation, and U.S. Attorney Jensen, I'm going to ask him to do some more work on different items as well. And I'm going to wait till all the evidence is and I get their recommendations as to what they found and how serious it is. But if we were to find wrongdoing in the sense of any criminal act, obviously we would follow through on that. But again, just because something may even stink to high heaven and appear everyone to be bad, we still have to apply the right standard and be convinced that there's a violation of a criminal statute and that we can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. The same standard applies to everybody.
Catherine, can you walk us through a bit of what the Attorney General is saying there, break it down for us? And also, I just want to ask if there was anything in that interview that really surprised you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just want to decode a couple of pieces of it. So, first of all, you heard this name Jensen. That's a reference to the U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District of Missouri, Jeffrey Jensen. And he was appointed by the Attorney General a few months ago to do sort of an independent review of the criminal prosecution of General Flynn and to examine what Major was talking about, whether all of these records that the government was required to provide under the law to the defense were provided. And the answer was they were not provided. And these new records were recently unsealed here in Washington, D.C., and the Attorney General told CBS News it was on the basis of some of that new evidence that he decided to move to dismiss the charges against General Flynn. In part, he said, because there were records that showed that in late December of 2016 and early January of 2017, the FBI had made a decision to close this counterintelligence investigation into General Flynn, citing lack of derogatory information. So they hadn't found anything bad. They'd run it for a while. It was time to close it. But then an FBI agent, Peter Strzok, he's the one who's associated with these controversial anti-Trump texts, intervened and managed to keep the case open even though it was supposed to be shut. And it was under that umbrella that they launched the interview of General Flynn at the White House on January 24th. And they did not follow proper procedure in the sense that they gave the White House a heads up that they were going to interview someone from the administration. And Director Comey has said publicly after, or as part of his book tour, that they went around the White House because it was kind of chaotic. And he said he might not have done that with another administration. And Flynn was interviewed sort of outside sort of the standards of regular procedure, and he didn't have a lawyer at that time. Final point, he talks about someone called Durham. That's the U.S. Attorney in Connecticut, John Durham, who's been tasked by the Justice Department to look at the FBI's Russia investigation. And based on our reporting here at CBS News, they're really focused in on this January 2017 to May 2017 timeframe, when the special counsel was appointed after the firing of Director Comey. And what caught my attention in the Attorney General's description is he said, you know, Durham is not doing a report, he's doing a criminal investigation, and at the end, what I have to judge is whether a crime has been committed. And he said, it doesn't matter if it stinks to high heaven. In other words, it doesn't matter if it looks bad or it feels bad or there was no moral compass involved. He's asking, did it break any laws? Because one of the commitments he made in that interview to CBS News is that he wants to stop what he believes is the use of the Justice Department and the FBI as sort of political cudgels between this, you know, in this division here in the United States. So that caught my attention, and I felt it was a way of signaling there may not be a lot of indictments at the end of this. There may not be, which is what President Trump's supporters want. What Attorney General Barr says he's after is whether, if there are violations, do they meet that high standard for criminal prosecution? So stripping the politics out of this.
Well, with the world feeling like it's upside down right now, what an interesting, journey back in time 3 years ago when the world also felt completely crazy. Major Garrett, Catherine Herridge, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.